and to be loving in our behavior as we imitate God. And so Paul expands on this now as he's talking about being an imitator of God, that because God is light, we also are to walk in light. So how do we do this? What does it mean to walk in light? That's where we're going to go this morning. So first, let's take a look at verse 8. We're going to start and walk right through the passage. To walk as children of light, first we must understand the difference between light and darkness. Verse 8 says, "You were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light." So the idea here is clear. A person who is saved from sin should no longer be walking in sin, but should be walking as a purified person, as a redeemed person. And understand that the verb here, were, for you were formerly darkness, indicates a couple things. First, it's past tense. This is what you were in the past. It no longer applies. He's talking about a past condition that no longer exists. You are no longer in darkness if you're saved. You were in darkness, but you are no longer in darkness. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1 says, "You were dead in your trespasses and sins." If you want to turn to 1 Corinthians 6, verse 11 says, "Such were some of you." In that passage, he's talking about specific sins in verses 9 and 10, fornication, idolatry, adultery, homosexuality, thievery, covetousness, drunkards. And in verse 11, he says, "Such were some of you." This is past tense, your past life. But whatever we were before we were saved, we are no longer now. We've been changed. We've been transformed into something new. Paul's been going into great detail about that transformation in the second half of Ephesians. We know what we are, therefore live that way. And second, if you look at the verb itself, for you were formerly darkness, there's no modifiers to that. There's no pronouns. There's no prepositions. It's not saying you were of darkness or you were in darkness. It just says you were darkness. So it's talking about a complete description of our total existence or our total being before we came to Christ. This is what we were. We were darkness. We were spiritually dead. We were children of wrath. We were excluded from the life of God. We were strangers to the covenants of promise. We were in the kingdom of Satan, but we're no longer any of those things. What are we now? You were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Everything has changed. When you see those words, but now, there's a complete transformation. And just like the word were, the word are doesn't have any modifiers in it either. This is your present reality. You were darkness, you are now light. You're no longer darkness. You're no longer in the miry clay. Your feet are set on a rock. You're no longer dead. You are alive in Christ. You're no longer strangers to the covenants of promise. You're part of the family. You're in the in. You're not on the out. You're no longer outside the kingdom. You're a citizen of the kingdom. And so this is the change that he's talking about. And when we grasp these truths, the next phrase that he uses is walk that way. So we understand the difference between darkness and light, what Christ has done. We've been going over that as we've been preaching through Ephesians. And so Paul says, you were darkness, you are light, so therefore walk now as children of light. So the first thing is really to understand salvation completely, what it is, in order to walk as children of light. But then he gets more detailed. Number two, to walk as children of light, we must understand the characteristics of light, and he gives us what those are clearly in verse 9. He says, "For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth." So as we aim to obey the command to walk in the light, this is what we're aiming for. It's these things that Paul is laying out for us. If we go back to verse 1 again and consider the imperative to be imitators of God, we understand that obligation began with verse 2, to walk in love. And so he now expands this to include walk in light. God is light, therefore to be imitators of God, we are to walk as children of light. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, as the Bible describes God as light, there were those two main aspects. There's the intellectual aspect of God as truth. There's the moral aspect of God as being good and righteous and holy. And if you look at those three characteristics in verse 9, you see them, don't you? The fruit of the light consists of what? Goodness, righteousness, and truth. So as God is goodness and righteousness, and it also includes the word all there, which we'll talk about. All goodness, all righteousness, and all truth. So let's take a look at each of these separately. The first one, all goodness. There are different words, biblical words, that are translated into the English as good. Similarly to the word love. We know that when the Bible uses the word love,